Hello, everyone, and welcome to my review of The Pilgrims Regress by C.S. Lewis. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We are not going to be summarizing the content of the book. I'm going to just be reviewing it. I will talk about some of the aspects of the book that I like, but the majority of this will just be my thoughts on the book and whether or not I would suggest that you read it too. Now, with a name like Pilgrims Regress, you should immediately be thinking of another book. A far superior book, in my opinion, The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. Now, I may have been setting myself up for disappointment when I saw that C.S. Lewis had written a book called The Pilgrim's Regress, because I am immediately going to be comparing it to The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, which is something that I think is completely fair to do because it's written in basically the exact same way as The Pilgrim's Progress, but again, it just doesn't quite hit the mark in the same way that The Pilgrim's Progress does. Now, the reason I think that, and one of the most important reasons why I think that, is because Pilgrim's Progress is a timeless book. It's an old book, and it still speaks today in the same way that it probably spoke back then. You don't need to be super in on all of the cultural things that are going on at the time because it's timeless. The message in The Pilgrim's Progress is timeless. It's for now, it's for tomorrow, and it's probably for 100 years from now. Everyone will be able to relate to it because the majority of it is a Christian walk. Anyone who is a Christian will be able to relate to this book. And the same cannot be said for The Pilgrim's Regress. And honestly, I think that C.S. Lewis even realized that he may have made a mistake later on in life, because he did add a chapter at the end of the book that kind of describes why he did certain things, the way that he did them. And honestly, when you read The Pilgrim's Regress, you're not reading the everyman's walk. You're reading the C.S. Lewis walk. Like, how did C.S. Lewis come to faith? How did C.S. Lewis kind of venture through the ideas of the world to eventually lead into his faith? And that's totally fine. But it's just not going to relate to everyone in the same way. Now, when I personally read the book, I loved the book up until maybe chapter 5 or 6. Once he goes down into the Grand Canyon, that's kind of where I started to check out, and I had more trouble focusing and paying attention to what he was saying, because some of the conversations that he has down in that valley are just mind-numbing. They're really mind-numbing, and maybe they were meant to be that way. Like in The Pilgrim's Progress, for example, there's one conversation toward the end of the book with a man named Talkative, and you can tell that the conversation is long and drawn out on purpose because his name is Talkative, and the whole point is he's very talkative, and all of the talking that he does is supposed to be very Christian. He sounds very Christian, but he has some issues, and that just doesn't seem to be what's going on in The Pilgrim's Regress. It's just a long conversation using a lot of big words, quoting a lot of philosophers, and it's just really hard to relate to, I think, for most people, because most people don't have these conversations and they don't have this background in philosophy that Lewis might have had. And again, that's totally fine if C.S. Lewis is writing this just to kind of describe his own journey into faith, but I really don't think that's what he's doing. I think that he's trying to show what most modern Christians do on their way to faith, and it just doesn't work. Now, there are a lot of parts of the book that I really loved. I really loved them, and maybe I was even misinterpreting some of the scenes that he gets into. For example, when he gets to Escropolis, if I'm even saying that right, when he gets to Escropolis, he's encountered with a bunch of different people who are basically androgynous, right? The boys look like girls, the girls look like boys, and they basically do little performances, and these performances are supposed to give him joy, which is visions of the island in the book, but the island just represents joy, and they're supposed to give him visions of this island, and all of them are just awful pieces of art, and the place that he's going to, Escropolis, is basically like a concrete steel city with barbed wire and whatever. It's really disgusting. It's an ugly city, and it's supposed to represent like modernism, and all of the art that is in this modernism city is awful, and everyone knows it's awful, and anyone who says that something is awful is basically just proving that the art is amazing. And one of the characters actually says, you're persecuting me, and all great artists are persecuted, so since you're persecuting me, that means my art is great. And I mean, honestly, for someone like me who hates modern art, I thought this was hilarious, because just because you're persecuted obviously doesn't mean your art is good. But this is a kind of a sidetrack. I'll maybe talk about why I hate modern art so much in another video. But modern art is just atrocious, and he really kind of hits it on the head in that chapter where he goes to Ascropolis, and I really enjoyed it. But I also enjoyed the beginning of the book when he's in Puritania. In Puritania, all these people, they're putting on masks, and whether or not that's supposed to represent people putting on masks at church to pretend like everything's fine, whatever it is supposed to mean, they describe God as kind of like a moral monster, not just kind of in your face, but they're implying that God is a moral monster, that he gets to evict people from the land whenever he wants. But he's such a generous landlord, because he just lets us live here in the first place. He's such a nice guy, And the whole point is to show that the landlord is kind of a monster, but people are pretending like he's being really nice. And since it's chapter 1, this is probably C.S. Lewis when in his youth, when he's a young kid, this is how people described God to him, and he thought that it was atrocious, and of course he would want to flee from it. Now, after all of these things, he starts getting visions of this island. He, peers through a window and he sees this island, and this island is supposed to represent joy. And joy, this seeking after this joy or this island, will lead you to salvation. And this is an idea that is in almost all of his books, right? That if you truly seek joy, that God will get you. He'll get you to joy, which is salvation, of course. But he starts getting distracted, and this is one of the points where you might see why this book's not as timeless, because he, on his way to finding this island, he gets distracted by this girl, or it's a brown girl. It's a brown girl in the book, and these brown girls represent lust, and he's attracted to this lust, this brown girl, and they show up everywhere. They show up in his visions, and he starts to get confused and to think that joy must be the brown girls. And I mean, I'm sure you can see why this is kind of not problematic, but it's definitely a little out of touch with today's language. But it's funny. I thought it was really funny when I first read it, and then when you find out that he starts like having intercourse with all these brown girls, it starts to get weird. And then he has children with the brown girls, and they show up all over the place. It's just a goofy, weird thing. And of course, this is supposed to be kind of like a play on Freud, right? Where everything is sex. All of your desires are sex, and everything just boils down to sex, 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 and lust. And all of the things that you desire, all the joy in your life has to be like the root of sexual desire. And I get where he's going with all this stuff, and I enjoyed the beginning of the book. I enjoyed the chapters about that, and then all the different conversations where he's talking to different people who are trying to convince him that joy comes from this sexual desire that he has in him. Like I do think that that's smart, and a lot of the ways of thinking at that time were definitely pointing people in that direction. Like Freud's big, right? Everyone knows Freud, but then you get to other conversations like with Mr. Enlightenment. And this is another one where I actually really enjoyed the conversation. Not so much with the first Mr. Enlightenment, but with the second Mr. Enlightenment, who is apparently Mr. Enlightenment's son. So I guess Mr. Enlightenment Jr. But this first Mr. Enlightenment, the conversation is so funny, because he basically convinces John that there is no God, there is no landlord. And the way that he convinces John that there is no landlord is purely circular reasoning, and it's a really interesting conversation, and I loved it. I thought it was really funny. And then you get to the second Mr. Enlightenment, and the second Mr. Enlightenment calls the first Mr. Enlightenment a Puritan. He's basically a Puritan because he doesn't have the most recent views on everything. So it's kind of like a cannibalistic way of thinking, where if you're not the most enlightened of all of us, then you must be a Puritan, and you must be, archaic, fundamentalist, whatever. And it's just funny. It's funny. But like I said, the later on in the book, things kind of just drag a little bit too much for me, and I wasn't exactly thrilled with the pacing of it. And of course, you get to the conversation with Mr. Broad, and Mr. Broad is maybe supposed to be referring to Jesus saying, you know, broad is the way that leads to destruction, but narrow is the way that leads to life, right? Mr. Broad is basically like a Christian, let's call him, who has too much friendship in the world. You know, everyone's ideas are great. Everyone's ideas are great. You know, I'm a Christian, but everyone else is really great too. You know, surely I think that my way's right, but there's so many ways that are right, you know, so I think my way's right and all these other people are fine and good to go just the way they are too. And, you know, I mean, do I even have to say anything that, like, so many Christians in the modern day are like this? Where it's like, oh, you know, my way's great, but everyone else's way is really great too. And, you know, I mean, like I said, I don't even have to say anything about it. You already know what I'm talking about. And then there's Mother Kirk. And when you finally meet Mother Kirk, you're like, wow, finally a Christian in the story, a Christian in the story. It's not like Pilgrim's Progress where, you know, right out of the gate you meet Evangelist and Evangelist evangelizes to Christian and sends him on his journey. No. Now you get to Mother Kirk, and Mother Kirk is like kind of a breath of fresh air almost. If you're a Christian reading the story, you're like, finally a Christian in the story to lead him in the right direction. And then your hope is dashed to pieces when you find out that John does not go the way that he's supposed to go. He doesn't listen to Mother Kirk. Rather, him and what's the guy's name? Virtuous. I can't even remember his name. But they go down into the valley and down into the Grand Canyon, and that's where the slow drudgery of the story begins. And of course, there's even a character named Drudge down there. And maybe, like I said, maybe C.S. Lewis was doing it on purpose, but I just could not enjoy those chapters of the book. And then finally, at the end of the story, you know, he gets saved, and then the regress occurs where he actually realizes that the thing that he's seeking most is at the very beginning where he started. You know, there's these mountains where the people who are evicted go to be with God, and after they're evicted, they go beyond the mountain and they achieve true joy, which is where God is. So that's kind of like the big regress at the end. And some people may be tempted to accuse Lewis of kind of strawmanning people in the book, and that might be fair. I don't know enough about all of the different viewpoints to know if he really is strawmanning people, but with characters like Mr. Enlightenment, you know, I really do think that he kind of hit the nail on the head with Mr. Enlightenment on that one. And of course, with Ascropolis, I think that he really nailed it on Ascropolis. So, with all those androgynous people where gender is nothing and art is terrible, I mean, just walk into a modern art museum and maybe you'll agree with me, but it's really, really bad. Yeah, so, like, would I recommend this book to people? Probably not. I would just say go read The Pilgrim's Progress. It's a far superior book in almost every way. But if you want to know C.S. Lewis's journey to faith, you know, pick up the book, read it. It's definitely interesting. It's not a waste of time to read, but would I read it again or recommend it to people? Probably not. So honestly, if I'm rating this on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd probably give it like a 4. It's a more intellectual book than The Pilgrim's Progress, but I don't say that as a compliment. I actually think that hurts the book more than it helps it. I think that the reason why Bunyan's book is so much better is because it's approachable to everyone. Like, you could read that book to a kid and that kid would understand what's going on. But honestly, if you read Pilgrims Regress to a kid, they would just fall asleep. And that's kind of what I wanted to do in some of the chapters too. So take my review for what it's worth. If you disagree with me, feel free to leave a comment below. But if you agree with me, like the video, subscribe, and I'll make some more reviews like this one. Thanks for watching.